This is World Awakenings, the fast track to enlightenment with your host, Carl Gruber. World Awakenings is a podcast dedicated to opening your mind, your heart, and your eyes to the fact that the world's population is now, more than ever, awakening to all things spiritual, metaphysical, and enlightening, and just how they play an all-important role in our daily life. So join Carl on this enlightening experience as he interviews metaphysical and spiritual experts to discuss, debate, and delve deeply into the hows and whys of this worldwide awakening.
Hey, this is the show World Awakenings, the fast track to enlightenment. I'm your host, Carl Gruber. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Now, in this episode, number 131, we meet a super interesting woman, Dr. Ann Metz. She is a psychotherapist, researcher, and educator who focuses on psychedelics. Her work focuses on utilizing the transformative power of psychedelics and non-ordinary states of consciousness for psychological and personal growth. Although she has a ketamine assisted psychotherapy practice, she is particularly interested in helping people make the transition from recreational to intentional use of psychedelics. So, wow, welcome, Ann, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here.
Oh, Carl, so glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, you know, I've as my viewers and listeners know, I've had quite a diversity of all things spiritual, metaphysical, and enlightening. But I like to find out from my guests a little bit about their earlier life. So from what I read about you, you've had quite a bit of diversity earlier in your life. A fashion model in Europe, you worked as a reporter for an alternative news weekly, you're a climate change activist, a hiker, an outdoors person. How the heck did you end up becoming a psychotherapist and interested in psychedelics?
Sure. Well, I would say I'll start with the psychotherapist part. I think that like many people who come to become counselors, I was in counseling myself and, suffered quite a bit earlier in my younger days, I would say in my early 20s, and had a lot of stuff that I needed to work through. And over the course of the years of therapy that I had, I realized that I was different and that I had changed and that this had somehow worked. And I didn't exactly know how it worked, but I did know that it worked. And so, when I went back to school, I had this intuition that, this could be something that I could be good at. I'd always been very interested in meaning making and in the interiority of one's life. What does your inner world look like? So it was sort of a natural fit, I think, in a lot of ways. So, I was working as a reporter and newspaper person in 2008 when newspapers started crashing. And I sort of figured that I either needed to get out of that industry on my own time frame, or it was going to happen to me not on my own time frame. So it seemed like a good time to go back to grad school. I went back to grad school and got my master's degree and eventually got my PhD, and still consider it the best decision I've ever made. In terms of psychedelics, I tried psychedelics in college. I was a pretty experimental college kid and didn't really, I had a fine experience. I didn't really think that much of it. And never really tried them again. And they came on my radar again, of course, when Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, came out. And as I read that, I was just really blown away to learn about this sort of secret history, if you will, of psychedelics and their use within psychotherapeutic circles. And the more I read about it, the more excited I got. And so that was really my first introduction, where it seemed like it was this new way of approaching human suffering that wasn't just about symptom reduction, which is so much of what traditional psychopharmacology and also to some extent psychotherapy is about. It's really about trying to kind of heal the wounds that we carry with us, and also, I think, give us a spiritual experience. So that was really my introduction to psychedelics and how I got into them.
I have not read that book or heard about Michael Pollan's book. What's the name of it?
It's called How to Change Your Mind.
Oh, okay. Wow, I'm going to have to look that up. But, spoke about healing wounds. I'm the facilitator of a very large Power of Eight healing group based on Lynn McTaggart's research and studies, where people come together virtually or live to heal. And boy, I'll tell you, I've been doing this over 2 years. Seems like everybody has some kind of wound. Uh, I guess that's our adventure in a 3D form in a body in the world.
Yeah, we're put here on this earth, I think, to learn some particular lessons, and the things that we go through. It's kind of our job to figure out. At least I believe this, that figure out how what they mean and what we need to learn from them and how to resolve them, and that's kind of the life project I think all of us have. So that sounds like really cool work. I like the idea of people healing in community. I think that that's a big piece of how things happen, and something that sometimes gets lost when we're talking about traditional counseling and traditional therapy, because it is so insular. It's usually two people talking to one another.
Yeah, it's very cool, and it really does work. So I'll have to tell you more about the Power of Eight later. But with the theme of this show being why now are the people of the world awakening more than ever to all things spiritual, metaphysical, and enlightening, I have to ask right away: what role can using psychedelics or plant medicines play in a person's spiritual growth and self-empowerment?
Yeah, well, I think that why now is really the product of 100 years of kind of late capitalism and the sort of nihilism that comes with a social structure that's really based on the idea that we need to work and we need to make money, and that's ultimately the measure of us as people. And I think that and also this idea that we're sort of somehow so separate, that you are this separate being from me, and we're never, there's nothing that really connects us. And I think psychedelics really offer people an alternative, where they could have an experience of self-transcendence, whether it's recognizing their own existence of their soul before and after death, the permanence of consciousness across the lifetime, or if it's recognizing, a deep abiding connection to nature. I would say that that's a really another way that self-transcendence sort of shows up, that we sort of start to see ourselves as waves in this giant ocean, and it's a little bit fuzzy where you start and where I stop.
Yeah, well, we can dive deep in spiritual. Where do you end, and where does everything else stop? We can go deep spiritually into that, and it's all one and unity. But that's another show, right?
Yeah.
What about your personal experience with psychoactive plants and medicines? I mean, I read this on your original bio. I found that you had a bit of a bizarre experience taking psilocybin when you were in Oregon, and that seemed to change things for you. How did that come about, if you don't mind me
Yeah,
asking?
sure. No, I at the time was actually reading this Michael Pollan book, How to Change Your Mind. And I was on a very long road trip and was really at a crossroads in my life. A relationship that I had spent a lot of time investing in, and I sort of had assumed would go forward, really started to fall apart. And I was scared to stay. I was scared to leave. And I just really, really felt sort of stuck. And there didn't seem like there was going to be a resolution. And happened to, bump into somebody who had some psilocybin. And, this is not something I would recommend to any viewers, but I was like, well, what's the worst that can happen? The worst that could happen is, of course, it could be fentanyl, but this was actually just, a true psilocybin capsule. And, I had the experience. It was interesting. And then after the effects wore off, so I was lying in bed later that night, and I heard this very clear voice, which has never happened to me before. And it said, you can change your life. You don't have to wait for life to pick you. You can pick what you want. And as small and quotidian and everyday as that sort of thing sounds, to me, it was really profound. And I think that, I had been, as a woman from a family that had fairly traditional gender values, I have always just kind of waited for life to happen. I've waited to be picked for jobs. I've waited to be picked for someone's girlfriend. I've waited to be picked for that. And so there's just been this sort of sense of waiting, and I never really had an awareness that I had autonomy, and that there was some choice, and I could pick what I wanted in my life. And so this just was this big idea that I carried with me, and I didn't know what it meant, and I didn't know how to apply it or integrate it into the rest of my life. And so over the course of maybe the next 9 months, I talked a lot about this experience with the therapist that I was seeing at the time. And eventually I sort of realized that, I need to get out of this relationship. I need to sort of choose my own life. That was certainly a piece of it. And then the other piece of it, of course, was choosing where I wanted to live my life. And that's, of course, landed me in this spectacular place of Taos, 3 years later. So, so it was a really profound experience. And, I think that as somebody who had done a lot of therapy in the past and was always wanting to work on myself, I was really blown away by how much faster things were happening, that I was feeling like I was really able to kind of get to the root of what was going on with me. And I was able to explore, kind of early childhood messages that I had that, kind of gave me this idea that I didn't need to pick my own life, and really have compassion for them, and sort of nurture those small parts of myself, so that the adult me would be able to operate in the world with more, I would say, confidence and effectiveness.
What a beautiful blossoming for you, from waiting for things to happen and come to you, to realizing I can choose to direct life and everything. I do have one real quick question. I mean, this is just my own curiosity. Psilocybin, isn't that a natural mushroom? Isn't that something American Indians and native cultures use?
Oh, yes. So psilocybin is the active psychedelic ingredient that can be found in a certain class of mushrooms that we would think of being as magic mushrooms. But, magic mushrooms, psilocybin, fancy fungus, if you will, have been used for, really thousands and thousands of years, and have, there's evidence to suggest that not only were they used by Native Americans, here in North America, but also, in South America, and indigenous peoples all around the world, but also within the Greek and Roman traditions, that there was sort of a sacrament that the Greeks would take, that would give them an experience of dying before they died. And there are some people that sort of speculate that was a mushroom experience that the temple at Eleusis would offer people, and that was this great spiritual experience. So even within Western traditions, psilocybin and fermented things have had a role in spiritual growth and spiritual development.
Wow, even the Greeks did it. Maybe Plato was doing shrooms, huh?
Well, I think he probably was, I think that we sometimes write the Greeks off. We think like, oh gosh, they had this really sophisticated government, and they were so advanced in literature and in music. And then you think about Greek and Roman religion, and it just feels kind of silly. It's like they think these gods did these things. And so I think that there's a more complicated story that we just kind of don't know, because the record has been lost. And I think it has to do something with the spiritual mushroom sacrament.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm curious, why do psychedelics help with depression? And does one work better than the other?
Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of explanations for why mushrooms or psilocybin can be helpful with depression. And I think that a big one is that it interrupts what we would call the default mode network. And so we think about the default mode network, and you can think about that as the way that your brain naturally reacts to things. So maybe you have a bias to always think that when someone looks at you funny, that means that they don't like you, and that's your default interpretation. What is the map that you use to interpret the world? And so psychedelics, and particularly psilocybin, are able to sort of interrupt that. And so that you're able to kind of shift perspective slightly, and you're able to sort of see like, oh, well, maybe that's not actually the case. Maybe the way I'm interpreting that interaction with someone isn't accurate. Maybe they're tired, or they didn't understand what it was that I was saying. And so that it basically kind of gets us to interrogate and sometimes potentially replace the way that we naturally interact with the world. So that's a part of it. Other explanations are that it stimulates neurogenesis. So we used to think that with neurons in the brain, we were born with a certain number and that was all we got throughout life. But really what contemporary neuroscience has sort of shown is that when we are putting our brain into certain environments, we're actually generating new neurons. And there's a lot of evidence to sort of suggest that psilocybin is something that is one of those special environments that encourages neurogenesis. So is learning to speak a new language, learning to play a new instrument, things like that. Those are also things.
Wow, this is so interesting. And I haven't had any personal experience with these except when I was a hippie in college.
Care to tell us about that story?
No, that's all right. I'll do. But that was hundreds of years ago, so or so it seems. Now, I would like to find out: does it make a difference if the psychoactive substance is organic or synthetic?
Well, that's a really good question. And I would like to think that some of the new versions of psilocybin that they're coming up with that are synthetic work just the same way that the organic plants work. But who knows? I haven't really read that much research. My hope is that I think that one of the things they're trying to do is making the experience shorter and time frame. So psilocybin, it'll be in your system for anywhere between 4 to 6 hours. And so if you were to imagine what that would look like in terms of a session, having a therapist like myself there for 4 to 6 hours would be really expensive. And if there was a way that they could shorten the length of time somehow and still have the same sort of effect, that would be desirable. So my thinking is that a lot of these synthetic versions of psilocybin kind of do things like that. Another example is, of course, LSD, MDMA. These are all synthetic versions that are created in labs, and they all just work a little bit differently. And I think that MDMA is thought of as an empathogen, that it's really helpful for helping people tap into empathy, feeling connection to others. And so that's really one of the strengths that it has, which is very different than what psilocybin does. So that's a great question. I have to look more into that.
Yeah, really, really, really interesting stuff. So what I would like to find out too is, could you tell us more about your ketamine assisted therapy? What's that all about?
Sure. So first of all, ketamine is not what we think of as a classical psychedelic. It's the class of drugs it's called a dissociative anesthetic. So ketamine has probably been used, if you've ever had general anesthesia for a surgery or something like that, you probably have had ketamine in the cocktail that the anesthesiologist used. And it's a painkiller. And we've known what its effects are, and it's been in use for probably 60 years at this point. But one of the things people started realizing in the 70s and 80s is that it seemed to have some benefit for treatment-resistant depression. And so it is used off-label, or what we consider off-label, for mental health reasons. Like the other psychedelics, ketamine seems to interrupt the default mode network, and it also seems to stimulate neurogenesis. And it also creates a sort of social connections in a nice way. And so if that's a layer of what someone is struggling with, ketamine can be a nice way of kind of working through some of those issues of attachment or interpersonal functioning. And the way it usually works is folks get in touch with me, and we do a couple of sessions of preparation where I talk to them about, what their experiences have been with psychedelics, what it is that they're hoping to get out of it. We work on setting intentions and, exploring some of the things that maybe might come up during a session. And then they do a medical evaluation with a doctor who determines if they, meet criteria for this treatment. And then they're given a prescription. And then they actually take the medication. They take the ketamine in office with me. So we just create this very special container where we focus a lot on the set, sort of the mindset, making sure that clients are sort of ready and are open and are willing to be curious with what comes up. And also the setting. So thinking about having a really warm, supportive area where they have someone there who's able to, make sure that everything is okay, able to hold their hand, can, provide them with music and a special sort of space to have this internal experience with someone there. And then after the dosing sessions, people would have what we would call integration sessions, where people are able to, share with me a little bit about what their experience was. And we start to sort of thread it into their everyday lives and figure out about what that means. So that's a lot of what I did with my therapist after my psilocybin experience. I'm like, I had this revelation, but I don't know what it means. And so we did a lot of what we would call integration to kind of figure out how it applies. And, I think that people often think like, oh, the big deal is the dosing session. But I would say what's more important really is that integration piece, because, all of these experiences, they can be really, they can be ephemeral, they can be there and then they can sort of disappear if you don't figure out how to really blend them into your life, how to think about how you would apply this to your relationships, to your work, to your spirituality. And so to me, that's the really exciting piece is helping people to make these experiences lasting and meaningful.
Wow, there's some really great information there. I was sitting here thinking, I go, well, if we're going to do a ketamine program with you, obviously you can't do that online. They have to come to your clinic so you can supervise them in an appropriate and take care of them during that.
Yeah, I usually insist on people doing it a few sessions in person with me. And then I do have clients that I'd have remote work with where they, will, take ketamine kind of on their own, and then we'll continue to do the preparation and integration, but we'll just do it at a distance. So yeah, that is a possibility.
There's a real excuse to go on a trip to the magical spiritual town of Taos, New Mexico, right?
I hope so. I think there are lots of good reasons to come here, and maybe mix in a little bit of spiritual growth in there as well too, and between your runs down the ski slope.
The 1,000-year-old Pueblo, right? Yeah.
Oh, yes. Yes. It was closed during the pandemic, but it's open again. They just had their San Geronimo feast over the weekend, and it was so spectacular.
Well, earlier, and again, out of my own curiosity, you said the word neurogenesis. What is that?
So neuro is, of course, brain, and then genesis, from the Greek, is the idea of creation. So it's really the idea of creating new brain cells through putting our brain in novel situations. There's a sort of saying in therapy circles that the neurons that fire together wire together. And so our brains get in this habit of continuously reinforcing the same thoughts. And so we, get in little loops where we think this and we think that. And that's oftentimes what's going on with depression or with anxiety, is that we're having some sort of fear. How is this going to go? Am I going to get applause? Am I going to get tomatoes? And that continuously starts to loop through your brain. And so what neurogenesis does is it interrupts that system and gives you another way of thinking about it. And then these neurons start to get a little bit stronger, and there are new pathways that are built between them. And ultimately, we can change our brains.
Maybe that's kind of the answer to my next question comment here. Is what is it about these psychedelic substances that seem to have the ability to strip away the layer of the ego that dominates our daily consciousness and move them to a whole new level of awareness? Neurogenesis, I guess, right?
Yeah, I think that's a piece of it. I also think that I've become more of a believer in the idea that so much of what we suffer from, and a lot of the kind of spiritual dimension of mental illness and of human suffering, that we are kind of deprived. Sometimes we're deprived of a relationship to something that's greater than ourselves, and that healing truly begins when we have this spiritual experience. And I know I sound a little bit like Bill Wilson and the 12-step groups, that it is a spiritual experience that heals us, but I also think there's something to be said about that. And I think that psychedelics operate on that same mechanism, really, that it's this connection, this self-transcendence that is what changes us, changes everything.
Yeah. Wow. This is great. We could probably do multiple shows on this. I've read that some who take a psychoactive substance can have experiences similar to people who go through a near-death experience. And my most recent guest, Bill Letson, relays his real near-death experiences. Why? Why would it be similar to an NDE?
Really interesting that you would ask that. I have a very good friend who is the executive director of this sort of group at the University of Virginia Medical Center, and it's called DOPS. And essentially for the last 30 years, they have investigated near-death experiences. And, that ultimately the kind of what they believe is that consciousness is sort of the building block of the world. And I think on some level, psychedelics kind of relay that same thing, that we recognize that consciousness, rather than matter or stuff or, our physical bodies, are kind of the structure of the universe. Getting pretty metaphysical here. But I think that that's sort of the thing that people realize, that they realize my consciousness continues after my physical body dies. And psychedelics offer that same experience. Earlier I was talking about the Greeks, and they used to refer to the temple at Eleusis as having this where you die before you die, and that was the experience of having of potentially drinking the psychedelic. And I think that that's kind of what on some level happens with psychedelics, is that we recognize that death is very scary, and what's going to happen afterwards. And, we, through psychedelics, through the psychedelic experience, we can have this awareness that we continue on, that our consciousness persists after our death. So there are a lot of people actually looking, at the overlap of those two things. If anyone listening is curious about, medical school researchers, look up DOPS.
Well, you and I are both students of the non-dualistic spiritual text, A Course in Miracles, which teaches that our own higher self exists, that part of us that goes on after our body stops functioning. And that the reason that we can't connect with our higher self on a regular basis is that all of those layers the ego has laid upon us keeps it hidden from us. So evidently, that's what plant medicines and psychedelics have the ability to do, this strip away that and allow us to get in touch with our higher self.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so funny. I was a philosophy major when I was in college and did religious studies. And I had this funny relationship with this British theologian, and he used to call me the happy nihilist. Yeah. And, I think it was a pretty fitting term, that I really didn't believe in much, but was content anyway. And so the idea that I'm on your show right now, and that I'm talking to you about the Course in Miracles, and that I, have felt with my own being that there is something that is great and profound out in the world, I think is really a testament to how transformative they can be. And also, like, when you can get your ego out of the way and sort of see past the veil of illusions, it's meaningful, and it's grand, and eternal.
Well, this theologian would probably get a kick out of the fact that you're on this show. Oh, really? The happy nihilist. That's
yeah.
great. So, I also read that you're involved in the study and treatment of suicides. Can a psychedelic experience actually help prevent someone from committing suicide?
Well, I mean, I think it's always really hard to say what can prevent someone from dying by suicide. But one of the things that is particularly exciting about ketamine in particular is that it seems to have at high doses, or if you can get enough ketamine in your system, it can really reduce suicidal thinking. And so potentially that can be a helpful, a helpful treatment option. There is actually an FDA approved medication right now that's called Spravato, that has been approved for the treatment of treatment-resistant depression or depression with kind of high levels of suicidality. And so I do think we're, onto something, because you think about the traditional options for somebody who is suicidal and depressed, you have to wait 2 to 6 weeks for an SSRI to start to kick in. And even then, it may not happen. So I do think there are going to be some useful clinical applications.
Interesting. I had Gary Renard on a couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago on this show, one of the greatest teachers of A Course in Miracles in the world. And he stated that one of the best kept secrets is more people have died by suicide throughout history than all the wars, the deaths in all the wars ever recorded. I guess there's no real way to prove that, because, I know way too many people personally who's somebody in their family have left in that manner. So I would love to see that taken care of in a beautiful, loving manner. What is the best way for a person to experience taking a psychedelic? Should they be guided by a shaman or a certified therapist like yourself, and why?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. And of course, there are really incredible lineages and indigenous healers who have worked with these plant medicines for, many, many years. And so kind of what I offer is a different version of it. I wouldn't really say it's the medical model. It's more of a kind of wellness, spiritual growth model, but I am licensed and I am a therapist. And so, I wouldn't ever discourage anybody from going that route. I just think that, when you are in a non-normal state, when you are under the influence of one of these substances, you are really, really vulnerable. And so you want to make sure that the person that you're working with is, beyond reproach when it comes to their ethical principles, and that they're really, really committed to, first of all, doing no harm. There have been countless stories of people who have been abused by therapists who have worked in the underground, and also some stories of people who have been involved in the MAPS MDMA trials that have been involved in abuse. And so I just would say, be really, really cautious, ask a lot of questions, try to get someone to, if you are thinking about somebody working through the underground, make sure that you can ask around and get information about it. But, I have to admit, I think I prefer, if it were me, I would probably want to go with somebody who is licensed, because if something goes awry, you have a little bit more legal recourse. You can report them to a practicing clinical board. So that would be sort of my suggestion for folks.
Okay. Excellent. What about someone who's done a lot of plant medicines? I know someone who's taken ayahuasca 90 times, and she seems more awake and enlightened than most people I know.
Man, good for her. I mean, that's all I can say. And I think that, people can use these psychedelics personally and for their own personal growth. And I just think that's great. I mean, I think that we're getting into a time where folks can have a facilitated experience, but if folks really want to do it on their own and, work that out, I also think that's fine. I think that, as long as we're sort of using them with respect and, respecting the traditions that they come to us through, that's great. I don't think I could imagine doing ayahuasca once, much less 90 times. So.
Oh, well, evidently it works for her. What about somebody who's not feeling depressed, but is interested in having a psychedelic experience? Would you tell them to go ahead and do so?
Yeah, I think I would. I mean, I just think that there's so much that could be gained by doing it. I mean, the issue, of course, is that if you are trying to go through this sort of medical route, you're going to need some sort of diagnosis of some sort, whether it's generalized anxiety or sort of a low-level depression, because that's kind of what is required in order to get a prescription. There is another model, of course, that's the kind of community-based model. So Oregon, for example, has legalized, facilitated facilitated psilocybin sessions. They've been doing that for a couple of months now, and you don't need to have a diagnosis to take advantage of that. So sort of anyone can go. If you can get on a wait list and you can kind of pay the money to do it, you can have that experience. So I always am a big believer in the idea that you don't have to be sick to get better. But there are some complications if you are pursuing the medical route and wanting to get a prescription. And that will certainly be the case when the FDA approves, if the FDA approves the psychedelics that are kind of in late stages of clinical trials right now. So MDMA is in the last stages of phase 3 trials, and probably will be putting in a drug application in the coming months for approval. So,
well, I'm really glad you pointed that out, because I was going to ask about the decriminalization of it. I mean, obviously that's in the forefront.
Yeah. And I think that's, another kind of reason I was really drawn to this field is that, a lot of my research as an academic has been in the area of criminal justice reform and the decriminalization of mental health issues. And I do think that addiction is a public health issue and not something that should be dealt with criminally. And, I do think that particularly the decriminalization of psychedelics and plant medicines, I think is a good thing, for people to be able to utilize these responsibly. My hope would be that people would be able to kind of use them or get some context for maybe how they might use them, maybe do a facilitated session with someone like me so that they know how to create a container for themselves so that they can really get something out of it. Because otherwise it's just like fun time at a concert.
Well, and two, I was thinking about this before we came on here. Can a person experience a non-ordinary state of consciousness without taking psychedelics? I mean, I believe I've spoken to many people just through meditation and just spontaneous experiences that happens.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, you could use breath work. Spontaneously, it can happen. I also think hypnosis is something that is a non-ordinary state, but deep net meditation, I think, is a great one. Any sort of breath work is a way of experiencing in a non-ordinary state. So yeah, you don't really need the drugs. And as I think it was Ram Dass said, it's like if you've got the message, you could hang up the phone. So.
Wow, this is great. We are speaking with Dr. Ann Metz, a researcher and a psychotherapist with the use of psychedelics, and just an amazing conversation. I love everything you're saying here, but I want to check in with you on a little different aspect, and I'm kind of right there with you on that. In that I see that you serve on the American Counseling Association for Climate Crisis Task Force, and you believe climate change presents a significant threat to mental health and wellness to the people of the world. How so? And is that a big part of what you do too?
I think it's increasingly becoming a concern for my clients that they come to see me because they're having climate anxiety, and so that's one of the big ways that the climate change is impacting mental health. I mean, it's really particularly for young people, I think it's really influencing all sorts of decisions from, what field you want to go into to whether or not you want to have children or not. I just think it's, that concern about what the future is going to hold, is a really big one that weighs heavily on people. But I think acutely, we're all living in places, even, where you are in Ohio, hurricanes, tornadoes, they come there too. And as we increasingly have those, as global ocean temperatures rise, we're all going to be kind of in the path of climate events that are of themselves traumatic. And I also think there's a real sense of like loss of place that, the places that we used to love, that used to be beautiful. And for me in the West, I think about the national parks and I think, my gosh, is Yosemite still going to be around in 50 years, and so I think that that's another kind of layer to it too. And even more acutely, as our air quality deteriorates, as our water quality deteriorates, these sorts of things lead to a lot of physical health problems, as well as mental health issues. So I just think it's, My field is starting to kind of catch on, or we're starting to really realize it. But, believe it or not, 5 years ago, people would have thought, really, what does climate change have to do with mental health? But we're starting to believe it now. And I'm sure a summer of smoky skies on the East Coast and DC and in New York has really, I would hope would change people's thinking about what that's really like. So
I'd have to say during my lifetime, I'd say from my perspective, the world's climate and catastrophes of weather and catastrophes in general, earthquakes, everything is more chaotic than I've ever seen at any point. And so, yes, it can affect your mental aspect, but also, many people are affected physically from these catastrophes due to the climate. So, yeah, so important. I know that's not necessarily on topic of what we're talking about, psychedelics, but it's what you do, and I think it was worth mentioning. So thank you for addressing that with us, too.
Yeah.
Dr. Ann Metz, it's been awesome talking to you. Now, you have your own clinic in New Mexico, right? But you offer your services online, right? You have a couple websites.
I do, yes. So you can get in touch with me. I have two websites. The first one is Ann with an E, Metz.com, and the other one is nomorebadtrips.com. Pretty easy to remember those. And I do offer, I'm licensed in in California, Oregon, Colorado, New Mexico, and Virginia. So if someone is in any of those states and would like to work with me remotely, that's certainly an option. And for anybody who's not in those states, if you have any interest in working with me in person, I offer intensive ketamine assisted therapy retreats here in Taos. So it's great work. And I'm always happy to chat with people as well, too, if they just kind of want to get more information. So just know that I'm hope to be a resource.
Well, I'm sure you've written a lot of research papers. Have you written any books, or are you working on any?
I've done some chapters in some textbooks. That's about it. And, I haven't written extensively about psychedelics. The most recent article that I had that came out was everything you wanted to know about ketamine, but were afraid to ask. So, and that is linked on my website as well, too, if you're curious about some of my prior publications.
Okay, very cool. Well, thank you, Dr. Ann. It's been awesome. I love Ann with an E. My mom was Ann with an E. I know that's important.
It is. It's really the only way to spell it. No offense to the ANNs out there.
That's all right. I'm Carl with a K. All right. All right.
A lot of the good Carls were with Ks, I have to say.
Yeah, I knew I liked you. All right, Ann, thank you so much. Namaste. I love what you do. Your work is so important to the world and the people, and thank you for making the world a better place.
Oh, thanks so much, Carl. This has been a great conversation.
This has been another episode of World Awakenings, the fast track to enlightenment with host Carl Gruber, a certified law of attraction life coach. We welcome you to tune in to each and every episode of World Awakenings as we open your mind, your heart, and your eyes to the fact that the world's population is now, more than ever, awakening to the truth of all things spiritual, metaphysical, and enlightening, and just how much they play an all-important role in our moment-to-moment daily life. Much love and light to you, my friend, and thank you for tuning into World Awakenings.